What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. Today I'm taking you all on a trip with me to Barnes & Noble. I like to come to the Barnes & Noble around me every once in a while and just relax in the cafe, get something to drink, and read the books that I'm currently reading. And so today, for my first read of the new year, I'm going to be reading Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, a classic, a big book that is very popular. I actually read Frankenstein in high school, but more so as like a class, more so than out of my own personal interest. So it's really interesting visiting this book once again from the perspective of like, I want to read this for my own personal interest. Um, I already started reading this book earlier this week. So I'm in the first 100 pages, and so far I think it's really good. I think that, I find the story interesting that she started off, she was obviously married. The author, Mary Shelley, was married to the poet Percy Shelley, and they were friends with some other fellow poets. And supposedly the story goes that they were all inside one night writing a bunch of different ghost stories, and the origin of Frankenstein is this is what Mary Shelley wrote for their little ghost story game that they did. And there's other things about this book, supposedly that it's one of the first sci-fi novels ever. This set the tone supposedly also for like a lot of horror books, a lot of gothic literature. So this is obviously a very influential book. And this specifically is the Penguin Classics edition, which I really liked. I thought that the cover was really cool with the hearts on the cover, as you can see. And so, yeah, I've been really enjoying this book so far. I think that the language is really great. The way that she incorporates a lot of nature and describes nature in this book so far is really good. And so far, at the beginning of the book, you get some of the perspective of Victor Frankenstein's life, which many of you know and some of you may not know, is that when we talk about Frankenstein in popular culture, we always think about the monster as Frankenstein, right? When we think of Frankenstein, we think of the green monster with like the black hair and the bolts in his neck. But Frankenstein, in the original work by Mary Shelley, is actually the name of the scientist who creates the monster, right? The person is Victor Frankenstein. It's not the monster. And so in this book, it starts off where we meet Victor Frankenstein. Another person meets him, and he recounts his, the tale and the story of his life to this other person. And so what we get in that early parts of this book is, Victor Frankenstein's early life, how he fell in love with science, and how his, curiosity in the scientific world leads him to experiment, and eventually he wants to tackle the issue of life and how to bring life to dead matter, or not dead matter necessarily, but matter in general, right? And so through his scientific experiments, he ultimately creates Frankenstein, and he's freaked out by this creature, by this monster that he's created. And after he's created this monster, it eventually leaves, right? He leaves. Victor Frankenstein leaves his apartment because he's really freaking out about what he's created. And when he goes back to his apartment, the monster is gone, right? And then eventually, a couple years after he creates this monster, he gets a letter from his family saying that his younger brother is dead. And he goes to visit his family to help them in their grieving process. And he eventually goes to the place where his brother was killed, and he sees the monster lurking around in the woods and then climbing up one of the mountains nearby. And it occurs to him that the person who has actually killed his younger brother, William, is the monster. So it's really interesting how for Victor Frankenstein, it's interesting how Mary Shelley is exploring this idea that the very monster that he created and that he despises now to some extent, it's come back now to negatively affect his life. It's come back to actually kill one of his family members, right? His own creation is now the source of his suffering in this case. So far, I've really enjoyed this book. It's been a great read. The story, the language, all of it. So it's Friday night now, and I'm gonna go inside Barnes & Noble and continue reading where I left off, and I'm gonna get something to drink and just relax inside. Hey everybody, so I'm here in Barnes & Noble, and I got this little spot to myself over here in the DVD section real quick, just to tell you I've been reading this since I got here. I made my way through like 25 pages or so, and I'm at the part of the book where Victor Frankenstein has met the monster, and the monster is explaining to Victor Frankenstein his entire past, or you know, what's happened to him ever since he was created over the past 2 years. And the monster takes us through his story of how he is learning language because he found this family that he's living near in secret, and he watches them through like a crack in this wall. He watches them live their lives, and as he watches them live their lives, he picks up on their language, and he's learning language and words himself. He's learning about different things about life and about the human experience. The monster begins to go through his own type of existential crisis because he's beginning to ask all these kinds of questions about, you know, what is his worth as a creature? You know, is he just a monster that is worthless? All of the things about human life and love and having some sense of purpose to who you are, some sense of an identity as a human, this monster doesn't really feel like it has those things. And so, you know, Mary Shelley did a really good job of, you know, using this monster as a means of exploring what it means to be human, and that something like this monster has those same kinds of contemplations about their worth as an individual and about their own life. Because a lot of the stuff that this monster is learning in this book through this past couple years of its experience, these are things that we learn gradually as we grow as humans, right? We're kids, like first we're infants, then we get to like being older kids, and then we become adolescents and then adulthood, and all the things that this monster is learning over these 2 years, we learn it through a gradual process. But there's nobody there to like really guide the monster through this, and it's beginning to unpack life on its own means and through its own personal journey of wrestling with these big questions of life. And the trouble for this monster is it feels so alone, because we have parents or guardians and other people in our lives, other authorities in our lives that help guide us through the growth of life and the development of skills and language and relationships and all these things. But the monster is so isolated. One of the things the monster talks about is it's so lonely. And because it's so lonely, this process is so much more difficult for it. And it really struggles with the great questions of life. It really struggles with a sense of, you know, having a sense of self-esteem or self-value as this monster that was just randomly created and no one loves it. It doesn't have the ability to connect with anyone. So it's really interesting how Mary Shelley is exploring these kinds of feelings through the story of this monster that was just randomly created out of Victor Frankenstein's curiosity. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. I'm going to head back home, and I will keep reading tonight. And I will let you know what I think. Hey everybody, I'm back. So I finished that book, Frankenstein, over the weekend, and it was amazing. I loved this book, okay? So the last thing we talked about was Frankenstein. We start to see a bit of his life. We begin to learn about what's happened to him in those past 2 years and ultimately the hardship that he has experienced in terms of being such an outcast and so lonely and so incapable of connecting with other people because everybody just thinks he's a gross monster. And in the end, the monster's solution to this problem is if I have a wife that is made just like me by Frankenstein, the scientist, then she will love me because she looks just like me, she's not going to be freaked out by me, and I won't be alone anymore. And so the monster propositions Frankenstein and says, hey, I'll leave you alone and I'll leave everybody else alone if you just make me a wife. And there are some assumptions to that, right? Because it's not guaranteed that this bride that Frankenstein makes for the monster is going to love him. There's no guarantee that she won't find him gross. Maybe she does find him gross even though she is made just like him, And granted, the monster says, well, we'll leave society alone. Well, maybe the monster leaves society alone, but maybe his wife doesn't. Maybe she's worse than he is. You never know, right? And at first, Frankenstein agrees to, do this favor for the monster so that the monster will get out of humanity's business. But essentially what happens is he eventually starts to reflect over, one, he's creating another monster, which could potentially be dangerous. And all of these ideas that we just talked about, how there's no guarantee that this wife of Frankenstein is going to be good and will follow through on that plan. He begins to recognize these things, and he goes back on his word and ends up not creating this wife for the monster, which ends up making the monster really pissed off, obviously. And the book ends with them being in a type of conflict where the monster is trying to ruin Frankenstein's life, and Frankenstein is now pursuing the monster, trying to get his revenge and to kill the monster as a result. And due to the circumstances of the weather and the journey that Frankenstein has to go through to get revenge on this monster and its life, he ends up dying and passing away, right? So my thoughts on this book are that I feel so bad for the monster. I think I resonate more with the monster than I do with Frankenstein. Because the thing is once the monster ends up killing the people that Frankenstein loves, not just his younger brother William, but also his best friend and his wife, Frankenstein is all alone. And he feels this obvious outrage that the people that he loves the most in his life have been taken from him. Because obviously the people that we care about are a huge part of making our lives meaningful. And the same way that Frankenstein feels this deep sadness and melancholy at having lost the people that he loved to the hands of this monster, I couldn't help but realize and just take into consideration that this is what that monster was feeling. Sure, Frankenstein hasn't taken the people that the monster cares about and killed them and taken them out of the monster's life. But the problem with what Frankenstein has done is Frankenstein has created this monster without ever taking into consideration what this monster's social needs are going to be. So he hasn't taken people out of the monster's life, but he never put anyone in there. He never gave the monster the opportunity to have his own Elizabeth, which is the love of Frankenstein. He never had a close friend in his life that he gave the monster, right? And so this monster is feeling a lot of the same pain to some extent. There are some differences, but I couldn't help but realize that when Frankenstein goes on this journey, that he feels compelled by the gods and the ghosts of the people that he's lost to go and get his revenge on this unjust evil monster, he's ultimately driven by many of the same drives that the monster is. The monster wants revenge on Frankenstein for bringing him into this cruel world without taking into consideration what the implications are for this monster. And when the monster gets its revenge or seeks revenge on Frankenstein for this crime, right, against the monster as the monster sees it, Frankenstein retaliates by trying to go and get his revenge on the monster for taking away the people that fulfill his social needs, right? So I couldn't help but see from my perspective when reading this that there is some kind of commonality behind what the monster is feeling and what Frankenstein is ultimately feeling. Frankenstein, in the end, is like the monster. He's sad to be alone. And one of the interesting things I remember reading here was that for Frankenstein, it got to the point, because he's lost so much family at the hands of this monster ultimately, to cope with the fact of losing all the family and friends that he has lost at the hands of this monster, Frankenstein begins to see his dreams as real life, right? That's the life he wants to live, because when he dreams, he sees Elizabeth. He sees the people that he's lost at the hands of this monster, and that becomes the life that he wants, to be able to connect with these dead spirits in his dream. And when he wakes up, all it is the painful memory of their lives and how he's lost them. All his life is in his waking hours is the constant reminder of his loss and his attempt to, get revenge, even though it's exhausting him and it's not a life worth living of constantly chasing this monster around in the harsh cold and in the harsh environmental circumstances. But he feels that he is compelled to do this, and that obviously must not be a very fun life, and it makes sense why he would seek solace in trying to have some kind of joy in his dreams. An interesting question that this book arises is, if you look at this Frankenstein and monster dynamic, what are Frankenstein's responsibilities to the monster? If we could actually create life in terms of just creating our own person and then, being able to imbue them with life in some way, what kind of obligations would we have for a creature like that? Would Frankenstein be morally obligated to create one person or maybe other monsters for this monster to have those social needs met? Because essentially Frankenstein was using things from the graveyard. He was using organs that he found to create this monster. And so if you're going to make a monster that has many of the same needs as humans, you're probably going to have some level of a responsibility that you have to hold in making sure that you are providing a way for this monster to have their basic needs met. And it doesn't seem as if Frankenstein realized or ever really thought about that responsibility, right? When he was creating the monster. He was just driven by his curiosity. He was just driven by his curiosity. And he didn't really think through the whole scope of what he was doing when he made this monster. And that's the interesting thing about this book, is that for Frankenstein, because he didn't really think this through, because he was just guided by this curiosity, and he didn't think it all the way through, he now has to suffer the consequences for not thinking it all the way through. His creation gets out of hand, and it becomes more than he thought. He didn't really think, okay, once I've created life,
here are all the problems that could arise. He just said, I want to create life. And he ended his reflection on the issue and everything that would arise from that at the point of, I'm curious, I want to create monster. Once I create monster, it will be really interesting. And you can potentially find some kind of parallel behind Frankenstein in that regard and humanity in general, right? On the one hand, sure, curiosity is a great thing. Scientific innovation is a great thing. Being driven to learn more about certain things so that we could potentially create something that can help humanity is obviously a great thing. But we as humans, when we don't really take into consideration the full implications of what we might be creating and how we might be acquiring so much power as a species, as we create more and we create more and we learn more and we learn more, and we try to take that knowledge and put it into action, it might be the case that we let this power and we let our creations get out of hand. You could apply this idea to humans and creating things that allow us to engage in biochemical warfare. You can apply this to humans and what will eventually be the case as we continue to develop artificial intelligence. You can think about it in a number of ways. Sure, we're going to create some fascinating things, but we also have to think about what are the implications for what we are creating. What responsibility do we have as people as we begin to create things that are very complex and can have a very profound, very powerful impact in our world? And it seems that Frankenstein is a lesson in what can go wrong when you don't really think about these things. And one last thought going back to the struggle between Frankenstein and the monster is the fact that I felt conflicted because on the one hand, once the monster has killed the people that Frankenstein loves, you feel for Frankenstein, and part of you wants Frankenstein to get his revenge. Part of you is like Team Frankenstein, hunt the monster down, kill him for destroying your family, make sure that you're able to get that revenge that a lot of us would want ourselves if somebody killed our loved ones, right? And took everything away from us. But at the same time, I kept thinking back to the chapter where the monster begins to talk about their journey and their self. And I began to feel and be like, dang, I don't encourage the monster. I don't think that it was a good idea for this monster to kill anybody. Obviously, I think that would be immoral. But the point being is that you begin to kind of understand that this monster is in so much pain, and the same way that Victor Frankenstein wants his revenge, the monster wants his revenge on Frankenstein for bringing him into the world and not thinking about how can I make this monster happy? How can I give this monster a life that is worth living? And he's basically just thrown this monster into the cruel world without any consideration for the monster's happiness, for the monster's, psychological well-being. One of the things I did want to see in this book that wasn't really there was a bit more of the process that Frankenstein went through when he was creating the monster. Obviously, Mary Shelley couldn't go into a lot of detail about how Frankenstein made the monster because it would be impossible to actually make that monster and document, this is exactly how I did it. So I can understand some, lack of detail there, but at the same time, I would have liked a bit more of a slow build-up. It kind of seemed like when I was reading, Victor Frankenstein starts to do some of his work, and then before you know it, it's finished. And I was like, oh, okay, the monster's already ready to go. Okay. So in terms of the pacing there, I was kind of a bit the pacing was a bit too quick there in terms of I thought there could have been a bit more development and slow buildup of the process and the momentum of creating the monster and slowly and surely just getting closer and closer. And then the monster is born, but it was pretty quick. Anyway, what did you think about this book? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Let me know in the comment section if you've read the book and if you were Team Frankenstein or Team Monster. Or were you empathizing with both characters and felt like a conflict, kind of like how I did, where it was like, oh, you know, I'm rooting for Frankenstein, but I'm not at the same time because I understand the monster. What was some of your thought process or feelings when you were reading this book yourself? Anyway, that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have not subscribed to this channel, make sure that you subscribe so you can get more updates for the book content that I will be creating. I'll see you all next time. Bye.